Well, everybody, good evening, and welcome to the Space Coast Progressive Alliance. We'd like to welcome all of you to our event tonight that's called Conspiracy of Lies, Voter Suppression in the U.S. We have a wonderful panel tonight of three speakers. We have Elizabeth Hira, who is a Spitzer Fellow and Policy Counsel with the Brennan Center for Justice, Brad Ashwell, who is the Florida State Director for All Voting is Local, and Nicholas Warren, who is the staff attorney focusing for the ACLU, who's been focusing on voting rights, and they're specialists here in the state of Florida on the issues that are facing us today. We have some very, very strange times, I guess would be the best way to call it, when people on a large scale seem to be believing in a big lie. We know that Donald Trump, before, during, and after the last presidential election, was promoting this big lie that the election was fraudulent, stolen. Somehow people needed to be fearful of having their voting rights stolen, when in fact we know that courts across our land have looked at these accusations and determined them to be not valid. It even went to the Supreme Court and was rejected. We know that elections officials across our country have certified the election as fair and honest, and even the Congress itself did, before the Congress was attacked, of course, on January 6th. We have a wonderful panel. We'll be getting to them in just a few moments. We've got a little bit of housekeeping to take care of first. We have ordinarily, we have our presidents do a quick intro. I am the past president, so I'm not currently the president of the Space Coast Progressive Alliance, but Raed Al-Shaibi has asked me to speak for him tonight. We do want to make a special point of thanking our First Thursday planners. That is a whole team of people who make our events possible. Tonight, Ellen Jones, Bonnie Ida, Larry Abdullah were the key people that have produced this event tonight, and we certainly want to say thanks to them. I would like to remind everybody that if you are a member of the Space Coast Progressive Alliance, we want to thank you for that. If you haven't renewed your membership, we ask you to please do that. Go to our website, www.scpaflorida.com. And please do like us on Facebook. If you're watching on Facebook, we ask that you do check us out. We'd also like to welcome anybody that would like to join us. If you want to renew your membership, just do that over at our website. Our speakers will determine our recommended action. One of the things we always ask is that our speakers, the three of them that are on our panel tonight, come up with an idea, an action item that our viewers can do. Something rather than just being at home and keeping this information to themselves, something that they can do to change the world, to take action on our topic tonight. So we're asking our three speakers, if you would please, think of an action item that you can share with our guests, and we'll talk more about that later. A reminder that next month's meeting will be on the second Thursday of July, and that one is called Where Hate Resides. We're going to be looking at some of the horrible reality that hate groups do still exist among us, and we'll be taking a closer look at that whole subject. So again, Where Hate Resides, it'll be on the second Thursday of July. That'll be July 8th. So please take a look at your calendar, make a note. We'd love to have you join us then. And let's see, I think I pretty much covered all of the things that need to be done there, other than the fact that this is a quick reminder, and that is that we will have a Q&A following our panel. So those of you that are with us on Zoom, right now you're muted, but we'll be inviting all of you to ask questions. We'll be calling on anybody that wants to raise their hand. If you are on Zoom, you'll notice that somewhere, depending on whether you're on a phone, on a laptop, or on another type of computer, you'll have a little reactions button somewhere where you can raise your hand. And when it comes time for the Q&A, we'll be asking you to go there to raise your hand. We'll call on you so that you can speak to or ask your question of our panel. We'll talk more about that once the panel is done. So if if I might, we'll start by, again, introducing our three speakers. The order that they'll be talking tonight will be Elizabeth Hira. She's a Spitzer Fellow, Policy Counsel with the Brennan Center for Justice, then followed by Brad Ashwell, the Florida State Director for All Voting is Local, and Nicholas Warren, Staff Attorney for the ACLU of Florida, our wonderful guests who are going to be exploring this topic of a conspiracy of lies, voter suppression in the U.S. With kind of a twist, a special look, of course, at the state of Florida. So with that, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Hira. Elizabeth, you have the floor. Elizabeth, can you hear us? Uh-oh. Let me see if we can fix that. Okay.
Thank you so much, Phil. I wish that control existed in real life. I'm so thrilled to be with all of you tonight, and sincere thanks to Ellen for putting this together. And when she told me that Florida was listening, I said, Florida is exactly the sort of state that we need to be really engaged with this fight. So I just feel honored to have the opportunity to speak with you. And Phil, really nice to see you again. And I could listen to you read a phone book. So to get to spend more time with you is a real pleasure. So I am going to just sort of start with the unfortunate news that we all know, which is that all across America, our voting rights are under assault. And you have seen that firsthand in Florida. And the unfortunate news is that you are certainly not alone. We've seen, I have the privilege of working for the Brennan Center, and we track what's happening with state level bills all across the country. And we have seen, as of this month, we have seen 389 restrictive bills move across different legislatures in, believe it or not, 48 states. And the variety that these bills carry is pretty significant. Again, you guys know what's happening in Florida. In Texas, we were seeing proposals that were being offered to force folks who had disabilities to prove their disability before they could access vote by mail, attempts to ban the usage of drop boxes, early mail voting, as we all know, notoriously in Georgia and later in Florida, banning people getting water in lines, which really matters when we know some folks are in line for 10 hours. And I think if you're like any American who is really paying attention across this country, you are asking why this is happening. And the sort of explanation that we keep being told is exactly as Phil mentioned, this thing called the big lie about voter fraud, which we all know is just that, a lie. And when you actually look at what happened with this election, Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security did already declare that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. But what's really also interesting is not only was this election the most secure in American history, which certainly does not justify voter suppression efforts all around the country, I think the real thing that's happening underneath that claim is that this election has seen the highest turnout that we've seen in America in over a century. So Americans are more engaged than they have ever been. And I think what we are unfortunately witnessing is that some people just would rather that not be true, that they are not willing to compete in the marketplace of ideas, and that they feel like it would be more beneficial to them to rig the system of our democracy, to suppress votes and to steal seats than it would be to really engage with everybody in the marketplace of ideas. And I think as an American who deeply cares about our democracy and believes in it, as Phil mentioned, it's heartbreaking to see what's been happening around the country. And the events of January 6th they're certainly anomalous within history, but I think even more painful is the idea that our government can't even get together to have a commission to investigate what happened on January 6th. So I think, many Americans all across this country are just going, I don't recognize this country. I don't recognize our democracy. And I can understand how that would very reasonably create a lot of cynicism. But the reason that I'm on this call with you today, and I'm so thrilled to spend time with you when I know you could be doing anything, is because I am relying on you to spread what I'm bringing to you, which is really, really good news. And I know that after the year we've had, after the last administration, good news is in short supply. So I'm happy to share it with you. And my goal for us tonight is for you to come away informed and inspired and ready to share this news as ambassadors to your community, because we have an opportunity to fundamentally transform our democracy. And that opportunity is what I am here to talk to you about tonight. So it is called HR1 or S1, the For the People Act. And it's called HR1 when it's in the House Resolution, Senate 1, S1 now that it's in the Senate. And its broader name is the For the People Act. And I actually had the pleasure of working on this bill in its first iteration in the last Congress. And so it passed the House, and it did not make it past the Senate. But now that we're in the next Congress, where we actually have unified leadership and a real shot, things are a completely different climate than I'd ever seen them before. So I want to talk to you. I almost feel like, I feel like I stop people in the grocery store line and at the bank to just say, hey, do you have 2 minutes for good news? Because that is what we have with HR1. So I want to sort of divide the way that I talk to you tonight into 3 bits of my presentation. So the first is I want to share with you the content of this bill. And I think it is so big and so wonderful and so capacious that I want you to know everything that's in it so you can tell your friends. The second thing that I want to do is share the civil rights context of this bill. This is not a bill that's existing in a vacuum, and it frankly is the bill that we need to meet this particular moment. And then the third thing I want to do is talk to you about that moment. And I'm so thrilled to be able to share the stage with All Voting is Local and with the ACLU, who are leading the fight in the state of Florida. And I'm hopeful that this little bit of federal information is something that you can hang on to know that you are not alone and that there is something really powerful that you can do. So first, to talk to you about the content of HR1. Now, I call this the next great civil rights bill. And I think it is foundationally a bill that we haven't seen since the last civil rights movement to actually integrate integrate every American into our democracy and to make sure that everybody had a seat at the table in an inclusive democracy that we all want to belong to. So that's a pretty lofty claim that it's the next great civil rights bill. But if I really had to summarize what the components of this bill are, well, it's 818 pages. So I always tell people, I'm going to give you the summary because you shouldn't read it unless you're trying to induce a coma. But there are really quick takeaways that you can have. And some of the biggest features in the bill are really exciting and I think really pretty easy to grasp. So the first thing I always like to highlight is that it includes automatic voter registration. And this would bring tens of millions of Americans onto the rolls. And just for context, in the last election, which I told you was the highest turnout that we've ever had, that was 150 million Americans. And so you can imagine, we are the only country, a developed democracy in the world, actually, that puts the onus of voter registration on our citizens. So making that easy for them through simple interactions with the DMV, where they already check your citizenship, they already are aware of the appropriate questions to ask. In that simple interaction, you say, Ellen, I'd like to register to vote. And Ellen, or would you like to register to vote? Ellen can say, I would not like to. She can walk away. Or she can say, you know what, I would like to register to vote. And then she doesn't have to think about it again because she's on her state's voter rolls. So automatic voter registration, common sense, practical, and actually is in place in states all across the nation already. Same thing with same-day voter registration. And we know that there are certain communities, particularly young people, who report that not being registered is the single greatest reason that they don't vote. And we all know, different states have different rules about when you can get registered. Same day is in place in some places. It can be done securely. It can be done safely. It is very convenient. And just providing that is a thing that actually fundamentally changes who gets to participate in democracy. So the idea of an arbitrary deadline dictating this fundamental right feels like it just doesn't sit well and is a really important thing for us to fix. The bill would also provide for 2 weeks of early voting, including weekends and after work. And I just want you to think about this, knowing some folks are relying on public transit. We've all been there. We're running out of work. We're a little bit late. We might miss the bus or, we might just get in the car with just enough time to watch the polls close. And there we are. We've lost our opportunity to vote in that cycle, which just doesn't seem right. So early voting would make sure that you could vote before regular work hours, after your regular work hours, and you'd have 2 weeks to sort that out. The bill would also let people who are formerly incarcerated vote. That matters tremendously in the state of Florida. All eyes were on you when you did the tremendous work that you did to restore the vote to folks, and watching your state legislature kind of work around the will of the people was heartbreaking for America. But you guys being at the forefront of what happened there know how important that is. If people have served their time and they are living in their community, there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to participate with other folks. And so this bill would restore voting rights to folks who are living in community. And it does not ban voter ID, as its opponents have really liked to tout. What it actually does is provide a safe and secure alternative so that if you are one of the many people in communities who do not have access to voter ID for any reason, you can create a sworn written statement attesting to your identity, and you still have your right to vote. It increases penalties for intimidation at the polls. It prohibits folks from being able to make false statements. We know, for instance, in Florida, that the Latino community, which is 17% of Floridians, were targeted with misinformation about what was happening in the vote. And that sort of thing would be stopped by the For the People Act. It provides a full-throated endorsement of DC statehood and the restoration of the Voting Rights Act. It prohibits discriminatory voter purges. It bans partisan gerrymandering so that people get to pick their politicians and politicians don't get to pick their voters. And it also does really important work that you guys know very well in Florida about election security. It's providing grants so that states can get paper ballots and voters can be confident that their votes are cast and counted as cast. And in campaign finance, which is some of my favorite stuff about the bill, we're not only working on voter suppression here, we are doing this incredible work to actually diversify who has a seat at the table. So the bill contains a voluntary small dollar matching program where if you put in $1, there is a fund that's staffed or funded by corporate lawbreakers and penalties against corporations. That fund, $6 will go in for every dollar that you put in. And what that does is fundamentally change who gets to run for office, which again changes what policies get prioritized and what policies get passed. And then final piece is there's so many things in it that we don't get to talk about everything in it, but the Supreme Court is the only court in the nation that does not actually have to abide by an ethical code. So for instance, if President Trump had appointed a justice and that justice found out that she was the deciding vote on whether his election was appropriate or not, she would not have to recuse herself because she has no ethical code that binds her. This bill would change that. And then one that I think resonates with a lot of people, the bill would require that the president and the vice president abide by conflict of interest laws and turn over the last 10 years of their tax returns. So it really is soup to nuts. A lot of things happening across voting rights, across campaign finance reform, and across ethics. So I think a lot of people sort of have a hard time understanding why all of those things would go into one bill. It's not like we took all these different bills and stapled them together and said, here's what it is. And so this brings me to the second part of my presentation. So the first part was the content, and the next thing that I want to talk about is that context. And this is sort of where I want us to have a narrative understanding of what actually is happening with the bill in context. And so I think it's important to think about the bill as doing three things. So I think first, it is doing the leftover work that unfortunately we see still exists from the Civil Rights Act. It is beating back a lot of the ugly discrimination that we've been seeing, sort of really given an opportunity to rear its head in this country. So that's bucket one that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to give you some concrete examples that I want you to hold on to of active racial discrimination, often in voting, that explains exactly why we need this sort of bill. So one is in North Dakota. I'm not sure if you guys recall this, but they actually passed a really horrible voter ID law where the state legislature knew that one of the requirements that they were going to have for their voter ID law is that people have addresses on their IDs. So folks said, well, Native American voters will be fine because they'll have addresses on their IDs. And the state legislature was warned by the Deputy Secretary of State that one of the big problems with this plan is that the government did not actually give addresses to many people who lived on reservations. And so they couldn't have an address on their ID because they would not meet the basic requirement for voter ID as required by the state of North Dakota. And knowing that, the state legislature went ahead and passed that bill anyway. And so it was a clear example of knowing that Native Americans were going to be harmed and going ahead with that decision. Same thing in North Carolina. You guys, I'm sure you remember what we call the monster law. And that, as soon as Shelby County v. Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act, what we saw was really a specific effort from the state legislature. They literally sent emails from the staffers saying, hey, could you tell us how Black voters voted, how Hispanic voters voted, and how white voters voted? And looking at the methods that were used by those specific groups, what we saw was a targeting, a one-to-one targeting. If minorities were more likely to be using that method, it suddenly was put in this law and disappeared from the state of North Carolina. And down to, there's an effort, I'm sure, across the country that's really led by the Black church called Souls to the Polls, where after folks get out of church on Sunday, they put them on buses and they drive them to their church they drive them to the polls from church. And that's a standard Sunday activity in many communities. And North Carolina went ahead and closed the polls on Sundays, very clearly just making an effort to make sure that little old church ladies couldn't get to vote because it was assumed that because of the color of their skin, they would be casting a vote that some people didn't want them to cast. So it was so brazen that a federal court went ahead and struck down the law, saying that it, quote, targeted African-American voters with surgical precision. So there was just real clarity that this was the intent. It was racially discriminatory intent. And I think we like to think that that's some sort of stuff that died with the 60s, but it has been really ever too present that has not gone away and is very much still happening. So I think that's one set of things, is sort of the worst case scenarios of things that are really ugly. The next set of things is a different bucket, but I think one that's no less important. And that is what this bill does is fix common sense problems that are facially neutral, but also end up affecting some communities more than others. So I give an example of this. This one's pretty jarring to me. But in the state of Texas, you can vote with your gun license, but not with your student ID. And you might think like, okay, well, that's just a policy choice about, one type of ID against another. But when you actually start to poke around under the data, which we at the Brennan Center love to do, one of the interesting things you figure out is that in the state of Texas, over half of the people who are in the University of Texas system who would probably benefit from being able to use their student ID to vote, over half of those students are students of color. And when you look at who actually gets gun licenses in the state of Texas, this analysis was in 2018, 80% of the people who got gun licenses in the state of Texas were white folks. And I don't think those demographic differences were lost on the people designing this policy. And I think that's a great example of something that, again, is facially neutral, but is known to impact different communities differently. And were you to take it to court, you wouldn't necessarily say we were intending to impact this community, but everybody in the community knows that this was actually going to be the outcome. And another example of that a lot of people don't think about, also in the voter ID realm. So there are 1.4 million transgender Americans, about 1 million of them are eligible to vote. But guess what? Of the folks who live in states that might require a voter ID, 42% of trans people do not have an ID that actually reflects their gender identity. So if you have to show your voter ID, think about what that means. You're sitting in your car going, do I look enough like the person on my ID? Do I have a name that's reflected on my voter ID? And so for 42% of trans Americans who are in states where they might have to show an ID, they are deterred from going to the polls in the first place because literally somebody else gets to judge their appearance in order for them to access their fundamental right to vote. And again, the For the People Act doesn't say you cannot have voter ID. What it instead says is, hey, if your voter ID, you don't have it or it's out of date or whatever the problem is, you've gotten divorced and you haven't gotten your name changed, you can still use a form and attest your identity and securely vote for your state. And then the last thing, again, applies to women, right? So we know that in America still, 80 to 90% of women are changing their names upon marriage or divorce. And we've even just seen with the experience that California has had in Real ID, it's a real pain in the neck sometimes to get your materials updated. And sometimes there are documents that you've lost or things that are out of date that make it really difficult for you to access that ID. And so voter ID, even though it's often talked about as sort of a racially charged issue, ends up having all of these different dimensions that we don't talk about that, again, are facially neutral and actually not critical to security because you can take other secure measures like swearing an affidavit of identity, but really should have no reason to stand in the way of your right to vote. So the third part of the bill, which is my favorite, this is kind of what I love to talk about, because it's bigger than what I think of as table stakes. So it is table stakes in America that you should not be denied the right to vote because of the color of your skin. And it hurts me that we need to say that out loud, but it's very clear in the climate that we do that that's the thing that's happening, right? That your age shouldn't be dispositive, the color of your skin shouldn't be dispositive, how much money you make should not dictate your right to vote. And yet, and still here we are. So the battle that many of us are in is sort of to stop the worst things from happening. But what I love about HR1 and why I am such a champion for it is because it asks a more fundamental question and creates the infrastructure around it for a more fundamental question, which is what would need to be in place for us to actually create an inclusive democracy, a democracy that looked like everyday Americans. And again, that's where you bring in simple things like what I was talking about with the small dollar public financing match. And so again, electable candidates face these huge hurdles to be able to take a seat at the table. One of the examples that I think is really jarring is that there was a study done in 2018, and we found that Black women congressional candidates on average were getting a third of what their white or what their non-Black candidate, their female counterparts were raising when they were trying to run for office. And that a third of sitting state legislators, so women who had actually won their seats already, when they were surveyed, even though we live in this climate where we keep saying, oh, we tell women to run and they should lean in, what we actually discovered from the data is that a third of those women had been actively discouraged from running when they decided that they wanted to run. And so the climate is not actually one that's really hospitable. And I actually think that's an important moment for us to sit back and reflect about the fact that our leadership just does not look like America. So I love to raise that one thing that's really worth celebrating is that the 117th Congress, the current Congress, is the most diverse Congress in American history, the most diverse. And the most diverse Congress in American history is 77% white and 73% male. That is the most diverse Congress in American history. It means that we have a lot of work to do. Women in the House of Representatives were barely one in four, did not get their own bathroom in the United States House until 2011. So prior to that, they had to walk away from the House floor, walk away from votes, and use the public restroom. And I use that to illustrate that this system just does not contemplate having a diverse group of folks at the table, right? And I just think, like, when you think about other sorts of facts that are related, particularly around gender, in the history of Congress, 10 people have given birth while serving. And when you look at that, it kind of makes sense that things like paid leave or family leave have not been prioritized, right? Or that currently fewer than 5% of people in the 116th Congress, or the last Congress actually, reported ever having worked a blue collar job. So that data point feels like it's directly connected to the fact that it's really hard for us to get a minimum wage passed, right? 48% of Congress are millionaires. When people who have regular experiences, who know what it is to need a babysitter or to, again, need public transit to get to work, are not at the table, you don't have everyday Americans' needs prioritized. And I think that's the piece of the bill that I love to talk about the most. And one of the pieces that I actually had the pleasure of working on is a piece called the Help America Run Act. And this is an anecdote that I think is worth sharing with your friends. If you want to run for Congress right now and you want to rent a tuxedo for an event, that is perfectly acceptable. You can go ahead and use your campaign funds to rent a tuxedo for an event. But if you want to pay a babysitter for that same event, you need special permission from the FEC. And that's an example, again, of a super neutral policy that says, like, hey, you're going to have to pay a babysitter anyway, and the only reason you need a tux is for the special event. But it ends up having impacts on things like working parents being able to run for office. And the person who championed that particular piece of the bill, the Help America Run Act, Katie Porter from California, believe it or not, she is the first ever single parent of young kids to be in Congress. She's the first person who's out there talking about what it's like to scramble around in the morning and try to get the kids ready and get on the bus and then still read the bills. And that is such a common experience in America. And yet one person and 535 people in Congress represent that experience. And so I raise all of that context to just say, like, that is really, for me, what is important about HR 1 is that it looks at what the barriers to entry are. The fact that billionaires are deciding elections, the fact that we don't know who's buying ads backing certain people and others, or who is giving corporate support to certain organizations and, maybe working with them behind the scenes afterwards. All of that stuff that's happening really just needs some sunlight on it. And I think if everyday Americans had a seat at the table, because we understand how important it is to get to the actual work of governance instead of this intransigence and this fighting constantly about what our values are, we could get a lot done. We could get a lot done about climate change, about education, about healthcare, about things that fundamentally could transform our society because they matter to every American. And I think that is what I like to share as the takeaway of the whole bill, is that we aren't just beating back the worst elements of our society. We're trying to suppress the vote. We are working together to envision what it would look like for everyone to have a seat at the table in a way that really matters for the future that we want to build and for the America that we say that we are. And I think that's my last bit. I would love to just bring us to that final piece, which is the moment that we are in. So we have been coming out of a time that we all know too well has been steeped in cynicism. It has been steeped in pain and heartbreak, and many of us just do not recognize our country. But the story that I like to tell about this is when I was in elections council in the House, we put our blood, sweat, and tears into this bill. And, I literally just got Christmas Day off. My poor family was like, we don't see you anymore. We were all so excited about this bill and what this transformative bill was going to mean for America. And I remember the day that it passed, we were standing on the House floor and John Lewis was there telling a beautiful story about what voting rights he had fought for and the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the whole thing. And I thought, this is it. This is like, bald eagles flying over the Capitol. And I get home the next morning and I open up the New York Times, and the fact that HR 1 passed was maybe page 4 news in the New York Times. And their headline was something like, Democrats have done some annoying technocratic thing that's not going to go anywhere, and who cares, right? So I'm heartbroken, of course, because I thought this was so important and so big and that it was going to matter America and that it was going to go away, right? It was heartbreaking. But, life, the vicissitudes of life are a funny thing. And what I could not have known is that 2 years later, I would be sitting here in a chair with you in a climate where HR 1 is all everybody is talking about, that it is so dangerous that Mike Pence himself has come out to tell lies about the bill, that Ted Cruz is out here telling lies about the bill, that Mitch McConnell sat in a 9-hour markup in a Senate committee hearing to talk about the bill, that Michelle Obama, Eric Holder, and Barack Obama have all come out talking about how this is the most important thing we need to do, that Barack Obama was talking about it, unfortunately, at John Lewis's funeral. there is a moment unlike we have seen in this country, frankly, since the civil rights movement, because people are hurting. People are seeing what happened to you guys in Florida, in Georgia, in Texas, not recognizing their country and feeling helpless. And I think that's the one thing I want you all to take away. The moment that we are in means this is more possible than ever. There are a lot of cynical people who are talking about the filibuster and how this won't work. And I think that framing is off, because what it forgets is that this bill needs 51 people to pass it, 50 senators plus the vice president. It has 50 people in support. And if I know anything about the American people, it is that our voices can change minds. Our leaders are elected to represent us. And I think I'm happy to talk about this when we get into the Q&A portion of the call about what it is that I need you to do. But my call to actions for you are very simple. Chuck Schumer, the leader of the party that is the leader of this bill, the Brennan Center is nonpartisan, but we do stand for democracy reform. This leader is at the forefront of making sure that this can happen. He needs to hear from you on the phone, in email, and letters to say, Leader Schumer, I support you doing whatever you need to do to get this bill across the line. That can be breaking the filibuster. It can be working with people who are on the fence about getting them what they need in their state to make that happen, whatever it is. And then the second thing, which I am so thrilled to be able to talk to Floridians about tonight, is to actually just flood the zone. Echo chambers in red states and echo chambers in blue states are very different than what you all have. You all have persuadable people who are going to persuade other people who are in purplish states as well. And so I think keep talking about this on Zoom, on social media, and these borderless digital spaces that we're lucky to have. Educate people, share the information that I've given you today, tell the anecdotes that you think are going to move people. And I think the more that we beat that drum, that not only is this necessary, it is inevitable for America, the more that becomes the narrative that actually people have to knock down. So I think that's my last bit of a reminder to you, is one of the most powerful things that you can do to remind the American people that this is possible is every time you talk about this bill and people say that it's partisan, remind people that it's not bipartisan at all, that Jane Mayer in the New Yorker leaked a fantastic phone call that made very clear that the reason that Republican leadership is afraid of this bill is because Republican voters support what is in this bill. Americans all across this country back the sort of principles that are embodied in this bill, and that's everything from getting billionaires out of our elections, to protecting the right to vote no matter the color of your skin, to letting young people vote, to, as I said, changing who gets a seat at the table. So the last things I'll leave you with are these statistics that we know that 77% of Democrats support what's in this bill, 68% of independents, and 56% of Republicans. What they are afraid of is that Americans will use their voice. And so I have given you all this information in the hope that I've inspired you to use yours and remember how powerful you are, because we actually have a shot at making this thing happen. It would fundamentally transform our democracy. So thank you for letting me yammer on so much. And I'm thrilled to be here with you, and I'm thrilled to take your questions when we've all gotten to speak. So I'm excited to hear from our next speakers.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We'd all be giving you a big round of applause and a big hug if we were live, and we want to thank you again for being here. I want to also point out that Elizabeth is going to be doing an event tomorrow. I don't have the details off the top of my head, but I know we have a whole list in the chat. So for those of us on Zoom anyway, you can go to the chat and look at links to a number of different things that Elizabeth has done. There's an op-ed there. Very quickly before we go to our next guest, can you tell us about the event you've got going tomorrow? Uh-oh. Sorry that we muted you. How did that happen? We'll fix that. You're up.
Yeah, so I quickly, Ellen very generously dropped in some notes. The Twitter feed, I really encourage you to take a peek. There are a lot of very stealable stats that I think really resonate with people, so please lift those and use them liberally. The same thing for the op-ed. We've done an op-ed with the Brennan Center that talks about how this is the next great civil rights bill, with a lot of data that you are welcome to steal, and I think helps people understand. And then tomorrow I have the great pleasure of working with Harvard Law professor Larry Lessig, who has been a champion of campaign finance reform. So he and I and the actor Jason Alexander are going to be talking about HR 1. So the program is called What's the Deal with HR 1? And we just will be inviting people in to have what we hope is sort of a lighthearted and happy conversation about something that really we need every American to be engaged with. So you got a couple of wonks and a funny guy, and I think it'll either be a lot of fun or it'll be a total disaster. So I invite all of you to join us tomorrow. And
it's something I failed to mention is that Elizabeth worked her most recent gig before being at the Brennan Center was to be working as a lawyer in the U.S. Congress, and worked for Senator Kamala Harris, developing federal policy on gender equality and civil rights. later serving on the Committee on House Administration developing H.R. 1. And you literally wrote the bill. And so it's very, very, very much an honor to have you here with us tonight. And as people ask questions, I'd like them to be thinking about that background, the fact that you've got so much of this experience and you've worked on gender equality issues. It is just magnificent. And I'm going to ask you again to be thinking about an action item for people, or maybe several action items for people that are here. But let's move on to our next speaker, if I might. Brad Ashwell, Florida State Director from the All Voting is Local, or AVIL. He's worked to eliminate discriminatory barriers to voting in the interest of democracy, and he has served as on director, high level with Integrity Florida, Common Cause Florida, State Voices Florida, Florida Alliance for Consumer Protection, Florida Public Interest Research Group. And wow, what a great background that is. So Brad, you have the floor.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you all tonight. I feel like I've almost got to be the flip side, sort of the dark side of Elizabeth's presentation. She's presenting, all this wonderful action that's happening at the federal level. And I really wanted to just make sure everybody knows what recent legislation passed in the state legislature is going to mean for voters. It's going to mean for all of you. There's been a lot of conflicting information about it. The bill itself went through so many iterations throughout session that, Nick, myself, many others were struggling to keep up with it and make sure legislators knew what was in the bill so that they could fight on it. Just to give you a little background on myself, in addition to, working on democracy issues and elections in Florida since the 2000 election, I'm also from the Space Coast. I grew up down there. I lived in Merritt Island, Palm Bay, Melbourne. I went to Mel High, Hoover, Stone. So I know your area well. My family still lives down there. So
welcome home.
Yeah. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I guess, to kind of build on what Elizabeth was saying, I think this bill really well represents what she was saying as far as there being this sort of new effort to present discriminatory policies that look facially neutral. We've been kind of internally playing with the term logistical suppression or logistical voter suppression. It's very in the weeds, it's very processy and wonky, and it may look innocent on its face, but a lot of times when you dig underneath, you see, the impacts, and you see that it's targeting certain people, and it's usually the people who've been historically marginalized and impacted by every other barrier to voting. And that's not on accident, we don't think. So I want to talk, drill down on SB 90, which was the recent voter suppression bill that passed the Florida legislature. Talk about what it means for voters, talk about a few other provisions that don't necessarily directly impact voters, but are important to know about, especially if you do any third-party voter registration or anything like that, or election protection efforts, participating in those efforts. And then I also think it's worth talking about some of the bad things that didn't pass. There were a lot of really bad ideas that we fought back successfully. And I think that, one that illustrates that it isn't all gloom and doom. We do have wins. We do have successes in the Florida legislature as advocates. And we work hand in hand with the supervisors of elections there. And then I wanted to highlight some of the things that supervisors of elections could be doing in response to this to mitigate the adverse impacts to voters, because a lot of what we do at ABLE, and we hope to work with you all and others in the communities around the state to do, is to advocate with supervisors to make sure they do everything they can to eliminate discriminatory barriers to voting before election day, so that we're not constantly in legal fights as we are now. Actually, ABLE is in a part of one of the many lawsuits. I'm sure Nick could probably go much more into detail on what's happening on the legal front, so I'll stay away from that. But I'm going to share my screen because I have a little PowerPoint, and that might be more interesting than me to look at. So let me see if I can do that. Is it working? Host disabled participant screen. It's saying the host disabled participant screen sharing. I could skip that. Okay, let's just skip that. So, okay, I'm gonna get right into it. So Senate Bill SB 90, it had a lot in it. You know, one of the things that's confused everybody I've spoken to about the bill is what it does in relation to the timeline for vote by mail applications.
You know what? We may be able to get you that screen sharing. DP, can you help me with that?
I think I can give him permission. Yeah, stand by.
It's not essential. I could just go through.
As we said before, picture is worth 1,000 words. So if we can get you that screen share, that would be excellent.
I could just not say anything. That'd be great.
DP, I'm looking at an operation where I could click desktop 1 or whiteboard on my end. Is that something that would help you, or can you do it on your end?
I'm looking and I don't see an option why it would be turned off.
It's really not a big deal. I can just go into it.
I think you may have it.
Okay.
Well, if DP can't find it, then I can't. So I'm afraid it's back to you, Brad.
That's fine. Thank you.
It should be enabled. I see it set for all participants.
Okay. Well, I'll try.
There you go. You got it.
All right. Excellent. I got it 5 by 5. You're loud and clear.
See if I can get this. Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of these real quick. So yeah, just generally talking about SB 90, we're referring to it as a direct assault on our freedom to vote. I don't know if any of you have attended any of the Voting Rights Lab's presentations on messaging around voter suppression and these fights, but the freedom to vote is really one of the key ways to frame what we're fighting for proactively. So on the vote by mail time requests, one of the things that's confusing about it is initially they wanted to eliminate the vote by mail. Basically everybody who had already requested a vote by mail ballot, they wanted to eliminate the request altogether, just wipe them out. Different iterations of that popped up all through session. So where it landed is if you requested a vote by mail ballot for the 2020 election, then you'll still receive a ballot for the November 22 election in every municipal and local election leading up to that. But you will need to request another ballot after that election. And then you'll need to request one for every election moving forward after that. So we went from having to request a vote by mail ballot every other election to having to request one every election. But the good news is that provision that would have wiped out all the vote by mail applications on record, that got taken out. I think the important thing for you to do and for you to tell anybody else to do is to check status, to use the voter lookup tool on the County Supervisor of Elections site. The lookup tool on the Secretary of State site is no longer there. We're trying to work with them to get that back up. But right now, all the supervisors in the counties do have a lookup tool, and you can look it up and you can see if you have a request for a vote by mail on record. There are a few different identification requirements that could trip people up. They're very limited. You basically now have to give the Supervisor of Elections your driver's license or Florida ID or the last 4 of your social when you request a vote by mail ballot. You also have to give them this information if you make any changes to your address information, your name, or your party affiliation on your voter registration form. So this could be a problem for newly naturalized citizens who don't even have a social security number yet, but even for, a lot of people who don't have driver's licenses or Florida IDs and don't feel comfortable giving out the last four numbers of their social security. There are new limits to the vote by mail designees that could be confusing to a lot of people who rely on a church leader or a caretaker or a family member who isn't their immediate family member to turn in their ballot for them. The bill initially had really strict requirements on this front, and then it was loosened up towards the end. So at this point, you can turn in your own ballot. We're just talking about vote by mail ballots here. So you can turn in your own ballot, your immediate family members, which are spouses, children, parents, and they added grandchildren, and then two others. It wasn't limited before. So this could affect people who rely on somebody else to turn in their ballot for them. I mean, they might not know how many other ballots this person's turned in, and that could end up not being accepted. So this is, again, another place where voters are going to be really vigilant about checking the tracking tool, making sure their ballot makes it to the supervisor and then it's tabulated. There were a lot of changes to drop boxes. Initially, they wiped out drop boxes altogether. So in 2019, a law was passed that required every county to offer drop boxes at every early voting site, all the main offices, and then supervisors had the flexibility to add these drop boxes anywhere that could be an early voting site. So this was hugely popular. About 1.5 million voters used these in Florida. That's a really conservative number too. That was based on an internal survey among the supervisors. And I think maybe 50 of the 67 even responded. So conservatively, 1.5 million people use these drop boxes to return their ballots. And rightly so. I mean, there were a lot of concerns last cycle due to the USPS being assaulted by the executive office. And questions of whether ballots were going to make it on time if you mailed it. And then, with COVID, we had a lot of folks who were very concerned about waiting in lines. So vote by mail was sort of the popular choice. So the changes are that they are now only available at early voting sites during early voting hours. This is significant because in the past the last cycle, they had some sites available for 24 hours, which is really important for people who work several jobs, have a family, can't necessarily make it in banker hours. So that change alone is very important. It also requires them to staff the drop boxes, which from a security point of view is probably okay, but the problem is they didn't give them any funding to do this. So now they're gonna have to make a dollar and cents decision on how many of these to place. So, I'll get into some of this later as far as what we're advocating for among supervisors, but they're going to have to look at their budget and decide whether they can have as many sites. And it's going to be very important for us as advocates and you as people in the community to advocate for the boxes and early voting sites too, to be near communities that typically face barriers to voting. The bill does a number of things that create, actually back to the drop boxes. So the important thing there is going to be just not, for you is going to be not assuming where the drop box is. If you use one last cycle, just don't assume it's going to be in the same place. You're going to need to check. You need to encourage other people to check. That information, thankfully, will be identified 30 days before the election. The bill does require that, which was one of our recommendations last year. One of the problems with that is it locks it in. So they have to announce where they're going to put the drop boxes 30 days before the election, but they can't make any changes after that point. So I'll get into some of that later again. But anyway, so the bill does a lot of things that will increase the number of challenges or protests to vote by mail ballots based on signature mismatches and the duplication of ballots. So when ballots are damaged, they're duplicated so that they can be run through the tabulation equipment. This bill allows parties and candidates to observe this process and to protest and challenge these ballots. It also allows them to observe the signature matching at the canvas level directly, which is problematic. We saw this firsthand last cycle in St. Lucie County. I'll keep it nonpartisan. And one of the parties was really browbeating her to get them to let, to get her to let them observe the process. As soon as she did, they filed 60 voter challenges the next day. So we're on guard for this. This also presents logistical challenges for supervisors who now are going to have 60, 70 people hovering over the canvas watching the signature matching. And if we have folks who are conspiratorially minded or irrational, it could be disruptive, it could lead to delays, and then really calls the question whether they're planning for that, whether they're asking for extra funding to make sure they have additional staff to make sure they can maintain the order. What does that mean for voters? It means the cure process is ever more important, especially as you get closer to election day. Voters, and then back to tracking, it's going to be even more important that voters who vote by mail track their ballots. And if they do see a problem, address it immediately, especially if it's close to election day or immediately after election day. So the cure process in Florida allows you to fix a signature discrepancy, a vote by mail ballot that doesn't have a signature on it or one that has a mismatch up to 5 p.m. the second day after the election. So it's actually a pretty short time frame, especially if you're notified right near the election or immediately after. One of the things is kind of a sleeper issue. I think if you wanted to point out the poster child issue of voter suppression in Florida, you could really look at the implementation of Amendment 4 in the Rights Restoration Amendment and what's happened there. And this is sort of another piece of that. When that bill passed, one of the good things in it was that it protected or exempted the information of returning citizens from public record. So if I'm somebody seeking to make it harder for these people to vote, until now, I couldn't get a list of everybody who had voted or benefited from Amendment 4 and find creative ways to make their life difficult. That's now changed. That information is all public record. And the flip side is that we can get that information and call them and encourage them to vote and that sort of thing too, but it still has us all on guard. The other piece of the bill that's worth mentioning in relation to just things that directly impact voters is keep trying to find a better word to say than no solicitation zone, but basically there are these spheres from the door and now around drop boxes where people soliciting candidates or campaigns can't bother people in line and ask them to vote for them, hand them literature, anything like that. This expanded the no solicitation zone from 100 feet from the door of the polling place to 150 feet, created a new 150-foot no solicitation zone around drop boxes, and then added language that allows property owners to remove people wherever they are on the perimeter, anywhere on their property, really, even if they're outside of those no solicitation zones. So this is if you're a voter, this could be problematic if you need assistance and you're looking for someone to give you assistance. And there are lots of nonpartisan folks who stand at the polls to provide that, who are now going to be standing out in the highway or not there at all. And it's going to deeply impact election protection efforts. It's going to be very hard to have monitors at the poll, nonpartisan monitors at the poll, watching for problems, standing by, ready to help voters who walk out of the polls needing to speak to an attorney. So those are, I actually have a good 2-pager that I could share with folks after this call or share with Larry or someone to distribute, but
2 minutes, Brad.
2 minutes, wow, I'll hurry. So I'll just skim these. So a few other provisions to be aware of. It impacts third-party voter registration groups like legal men voters, anybody who's doing third-party voter registration by requiring notifications. It requires you basically to shoot yourself in the foot. You have to let voters know that you might not get their registration in on time as you're asking them to register it. And then you have to inform them how to use the OVR site, how to turn it in themselves. There's also, it expanded the timeline to 14 days to return the voter registration form. I'm trying to remember what the other piece was. And one of the big systematic problems is it requires groups to turn them into the county where the voter is registered, which is going to be tricky because sometimes that address on their ID isn't the same as where in the voter registration form isn't the same as where they're. Well, you get the idea. So they just made it more difficult for third-party voter registration groups, and we have a good handout on that if folks are interested. I know the League of Women Voters has done a great 2-page, or actually 3-pager on it. It prohibits SOEs from accepting private donations. This includes personal services from individuals, so they'll no longer be able to use volunteers. So they basically didn't fund any of the work. They prohibit them from taking private money, and they won't let them use volunteers now. There's a resign to run power grab issue that I'll probably leave for Nick because I think he explains it far better than me. They inserted the legislature and the attorney general into civil lawsuits where bad election laws are being challenged. So those are going to be more politicized moving forward, most likely. There's some new list maintenance processes. This is the off year when a lot of purges or list maintenance happen. So a lot of our groups are actively watching that. And they've created some new processes for that. One of the good things they did do, and we worked on, was to get them to finally address the online voter registration site. It's broken down 4 times in the last 3 years because it couldn't handle the load of the rush right before the book closing deadline for voter registration. So we've been trying for years to get the Secretary of State to just get an independent party to test the site to make sure it could handle that extra load, and she's refused to. Now she's required to by law, so that's a good win. I'm going to skip the bad things that didn't pass. I kind of touched on some of those. This is ridiculous. I think we all can agree on that. So what now? So what we're doing and what we are hoping you and others in the community can help us do is monitor the implementation of this bill and others. We're doing a lot of public records requests. We're doing a lot of meetings with supervisors directly to look at their budgets, look at their planning for the 2022 election. We're talking to them, making a lot of recommendations relating to their voter education plans to make sure they're informing people and it's not just us trying to tell people what to do. I mean, one of the big issues last cycle was misinformation and disinformation. One of the best ways to address that is to get supervisors of elections and the Secretary of State government sources that are valid, putting up good information that we can share and we can direct people to. We'll be preparing for next legislative session as well. It starts very soon. The committee weeks start in September. And I think a lot of our groups, as well as you, will be doing voter education. I'm going to skip over some of that. So just to touch on, I'm probably almost, am I out of time, Bonnie? Well, so I'm just going to touch on drop boxes because I think that's something where we have a clear idea what they need to do and can do to mitigate some of the damage from this bill.
Time's up, Brad.
What's that?
Time's up. Can you just wind it up quick?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things we'll be pushing them to do is to seek community input. To basically, so 30 days before the election, they have to announce where their drop boxes are going to be and their early voting sites. So we want them to solicit community input several weeks before that so we can analyze it, look at where that's going to impact communities, advocate, okay, so this box is near a Black community, you need to keep this one, you're keeping these 5 all clustered around an affluent community, maybe you could take one of those away instead, that sort of thing. We're trying to make sure they advertise where the sites are adequately, that they really use all their means at their disposal to do voter education. A lot of work will be on that. I mean, a lot of what we do is try to make supervisors of elections do their job. I mean, I don't know any polite way to put it. I think as advocates, we take on that work a lot of times because we feel like that's what we're supposed to do. But really, it's oftentimes the jobs of the officials that we're doing because they're abdicating their responsibility. So I'll shut up there, and I'm sure Nick will have a lot of wonderful things to say, and I look forward to the Q&A portion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad. We appreciate your work. Thank you again. We're all giving you a round of applause. If you can imagine us jumping up and down in the auditorium here, our virtual auditorium, we really, really do appreciate that. I would like to remind people that they should go to the chat area. You've got a lot of details there in the chat. We've got, I guess, a question for you, and that is, what would be the website that people could go to for All Voting is Local? Can you tell us what that would be for more information? Uh-oh. Brad, I'm sorry that we've muted you again. Let's fix that. There you go. You're back up.
Sure. It's so we don't have we have state sites on a national site. So it's just allvotingislocal.org. And then you could look for Florida on that site, and it'll give you more specific information. And anybody on this, you're welcome to email me directly if you want information. It's brad@allvotingislocal.org, and I'll respond as quickly as possible.
You could also post that in the chat if you would like.
The chat is disabled.
Okay. Well, you know what? It's avil.org. Is that correct?
It's spelled out.
Oh, allvotingislocal.org. Okay. So that's something that our audience can go take a look at. And I'm going to ask you again to think about an action item once we get to the Q&A portion of the evening. Thank you again, Brad. Our next speaker, Nick Warren, joined the ACLU of Florida as a staff attorney focused on voting rights. He's experienced working on elections and voting rights issues at the local, state, and federal level. I previously worked on the 2010 redistricting cycle litigation at the Florida Supreme Court. And Nick, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Phil, and thanks, Brad and Elizabeth, for your presentations. I want to touch on just a few of the other aspects of SB 90, the Florida elections bill that that Brad mentioned, and then talk about some of the more proactive steps that we can all be taking in Florida, and that we are taking in Florida, to move the ball forward on voting rights and elections, and to combat the big lie and the all-out attack on democracy that we've been seeing over the past year plus. So first of all, Brad mentioned the resign to run power grab part of SB 90, which was honestly one of the more concerning parts of the bill to me, because instead of just making it harder for people to vote, it took away people's right to vote altogether. In certain circumstances. So to sum this up, which I've discovered is very difficult to do, we had a lot of trouble explaining this to our allies during session. But for the past 40 plus years in Florida, basically when a local office holder resigns to run for another office, and there's a special election already coming up because that local office holder is running for Congress or state Senate or whatever it is. The local voters in that person's county commission district or in that sheriff or whatever the local office is, the local voters would get to choose who would succeed that local office holder who's resigning to run for the other office. And that seat would be filled by election in generally a special election. This law repeals that and says, in most cases, the governor will appoint that local office holder until the next regularly scheduled election, which could be as late as over 2 years from when the vacancy arises. So that's in the bill, and it was a pretty blatant power grab in reaction to the death of Congressman Alcee Hastings in Broward and Palm Beach that then triggered a bunch of local office holders who were running for that congressional seat or for the other legislative seats that those legislators were running for Congress. And now the governor will get to appoint probably 3, maybe more local county commissioners and school board members in Broward and Palm Beach. To turn this pretty shameful part of this bill into an opportunity for local action, specifically in Brevard and Volusia. Both Brevard and Volusia counties are charter counties. They have a county charter that the local voters enacted that outlines how county government is laid out, and those charters can be amended to make sure that that local voters get to decide the successors in office of local county commission and the county officers like sheriff and supervisor of election, tax collector, et cetera. And actually, Brevard's does provide that in most circumstances, but in some circumstances, it does default to the governor appointing. So that's something that we Floridians can be doing in the counties and cities where this is an option, is lobbying our county officials to pass a charter amendment, or if they won't, then there are initiative options. You can circulate a petition and get a charter amendment to do that. I'll also mention just briefly some of the, back to the more reactive side of things. As Brad mentioned, of course, there's 3 different lawsuits challenging the Florida elections bill brought by a number of different great groups: the League of Women Voters, the Florida Conference of NAACP branches, Disability Rights Florida, Common Cause, Florida Rising, the Hispanic Federation, Black Voters Matter, lots of different groups challenging a number of the provisions that that Brad outlined, in particular, the restrictions on vote by mail balloting, the drop box requirements that they be staffed, limiting locations, making it harder for people to drop off ballots for their friends and the people that they're caring for, who can't otherwise go and drop them off themselves, who don't want to rely on the postal service, or it's too close to the election to put it in the mail. And most significantly, the line warming or solicitation part of the law that is similar to what we saw in Georgia that Elizabeth mentioned, that essentially bans passing out food and water to voters standing in line. I will say the Florida law goes even further than that, is even broader somehow than what was passed in Georgia. And if you read it, it basically makes it a crime to approach a voter anywhere within 150 feet of a polling place entrance to try to get them to do anything, which could be, saying hi to your friend that you run into. If you intend for them to say hi back to you, then technically you're in violation of that law. So that's of course been challenged and has a good chance of being struck down, in my personal opinion. So that's the election law. I do want to say, like, where do we go forward here? We have, obviously, Elizabeth outlined the action on the federal level. That would be an incredible step to protecting the right to vote and protecting our elections nationwide, obviously. But we can't be content with letting Congress take the lead on it, and of course we're not. So this week, actually, we, the ACLU of Florida and the organization People Over Profits and other groups launched this Fair Elections for Democracy campaign to put 3 pro-democracy initiatives on the 2022 ballot in Florida to pass 3 constitutional amendments to expand access to voting in the state. And those 3, which you can go to fairelectionsfl.com. There's a take action button at the top. You can put in your information and have 3 petition forms sent to your home, postage paid, sign them, return them to try to get those on the ballot. These 3 initiatives, the first one, the Voter Eligibility Restoration Amendment, VERA, would fix what the legislature screwed up after the voters in 2018, a supermajority, passed Amendment 4 to restore voting rights to returning citizens after they completed their sentences. The legislature said completing sentences means you have to pay the enormous totals of fines and fees and court costs and restitution that you accrue when you're a criminal defendant. The state is not even going to tell you how much you owe. You have to figure it out yourself. The records may not even exist. It may be impossible to find out, but until you pay what you owe, you're not allowed to vote. So the voting eligibility restoration amendment would end that and say, if you serve your time, you finish probation and parole, you return to your community, you're integrated back into society, and you should have your voting rights restored. Our second amendment is AVR, a voter registration method for eligible Floridians. This would institute, like HR1 or S1 would do, as Elizabeth outlined, automatic voter registration for anyone who applies for, updates, renews, or replaces their driver's license or state ID card. So right now you have to opt in to voter registration or update when you interact with the DMV. And this would make that process more streamlined. Your application would serve as an update or a new voter registration application if you don't opt out. Of course, we're not going to force anyone to register to vote. Everyone will have the opportunity to opt out if they don't want to do that. And then our third amendment, the Register and Vote Amendment, similarly, again, to HR1, would institute same-day registration, which over 20 states have already, so that you'd be able to, if you miss the deadline because the online voter registration portal crashes on the day of the deadline, like it did last year, and seems like most elections, you would be able to show up to vote in the early voting period or on election day, show proof that you're eligible to vote, and cast a ballot. And those are the three initiatives. So we have to get literally millions of signatures, 891,000 signatures per initiative. So it's a big effort, and it's gonna take a massive statewide campaign in every corner of the state. And so my call to action, my action item for you all is to go to fairelectionsfl.com, get those petitions sent to you. You can sign them and return them for free. Share it with your friends and neighbors on your social media. So we're going to need all the help we can get to get these on the ballot, and of course, then pass them next November. And get 60% of the voters to approve. But these three, really any one of these, but these three together would be a massive change in how elections are run in Florida. It would mean that the legislature couldn't do a lot of the things that they did this session, or try to do almost every session, to limit voting. And it also means ideally HR1 passes this summer, and this becomes kind of a back burner issue, but Congress only has the power to regulate federal elections. So, for example, we know this November, several cities in Brevard are having municipal elections. There's no federal race on the ballot. And so the state could do whatever they want, even if HR1 passes in those cases. So having these in the state constitution would be huge to protect voting rights and access to the ballot box.
Nick, can I just get that one last bit? That was Fair Elections Florida. So it's FAIR Elections FL.com. Okay, we'll have that in the chat.
Perfect. So that's a big step forward. Obviously, something that everyone can be involved in the next months. But definitely doesn't stop there. As Brad said, working with SOEs, lobbying your local supervisors to make sure that voting is as accessible as possible, because the supervisors really do have a lot of discretion, even under these new rules, in setting polling places, allocating resources, locating staffing drop boxes, et cetera, and also providing information to voters. And part of the big challenge is just doing exactly what Brad just did, and educating people on what the rules are. And the supervisors should be carrying a lot of that burden as well, and educating folks. As well as local county commissioners. The supervisors, a lot of these things in the law were unfunded mandates, which the supervisors rightly spoke out against. I mean, it's really ridiculous. The legislature says you have to follow all these rules. We're going to make election administration as expensive as possible. We're going to ban you from accepting donations from nonprofits, which helped a lot of the smaller counties in Florida this past election support expanded voter access. But the supervisors' budgets are set by the county commissions. So those are some other local elected officials that everyone can be lobbying to make sure this should be a priority in your budgets, to make sure that you give the supervisors the resources they need so that everyone can vote. and is something that often gets overlooked. Corporate pressure. We saw, especially in Georgia and Texas, in some cases it was it was too little too late, but if these corporations start to think that maybe people really care about voting rights and democracy, and they're going to stop patronizing my business if we continue to support the lawmakers that are making it harder for people to vote and are continuing to promulgate the big lie, then maybe you start to see some of the kinds of corporate pressure that we saw at the very tail end of the legislative sessions the past few months. As well as just doing the legwork in your communities to, as we've all mentioned, educate your friends and family about these issues, activate people, make them aware that this is going on. HR1, make sure they know it, make sure they know that it's something to support that includes a ton of great stuff that would really remake our democracy and revive elections in this country. And then there's some things, some policy ideas in HR1 back to the local level that we can implement locally. That might be a lot easier than going to the legislature with the hostile legislature and governor that we have. Things like the democracy vouchers to allow candidates to run, regular grassroots folks to run for public office at the local level when they don't have big money support. And we have that. I'm from Tallahassee. We have that in Tallahassee a few years ago. If you give $250 to a city commission candidate that's matched, and you're a city resident, then that donation is matched by the city from a pool of money, encouraging small donor donations to support grassroots candidacies. And that's something that every municipality, every county can implement. So those are a few points that I would mention. And I look forward to hearing y'all's questions.
Thank you so much. I tell you what, Nick, you guys, what you do for our community, what you do for our state, what you do for our society is so important. For those who are not members of the ACLU, it's a small investment. It's a wonderful organization to be a member of. You get to be on the inside. You get to learn so much more about what makes civil society civil. And thank you for all that you do. And thanks to all three of our speakers. I've said it before. If you could hear us all clapping for you and jumping up and down in the room, we would be definitely doing that for you. We have such a talented group of speakers here tonight. And I'm going to encourage them to actually talk to each other as they talk to you during this Q&A period. So we're going to be opening the floor to questions from anybody here on Zoom. If you have a question, as I've said before, raise your hand. In fact, I see our first question has popped up. I'm not sure who was first here. It looked like it might be Larry Abdullah. Larry, if you can unmute yourself, and you now have the floor.
Okay, talking at the federal level for the moment, many of us remember that in 2000, the Supreme Court actually made an election by not allowing even all the counties of Florida to recount. So my question is, have we fashioned HR1 in such a way, because we know that there's going to be a lot of court action, that the Supreme Court, which is far more right-wing and reactionary than it was in 2000, will not strike it down or interfere? And that, of course, is why I'm worried that we need to do everything we can locally at the same time. But of course, it would be wonderful for all of us if HR1 passes and survives.
So who would like to take that question? In other words, I guess to summarize your question is, with the new paradigm of an extremely right-shifted Supreme Court, what will be the impact on potential voting decisions as these legal questions work their way up toward the Supreme Court? Elizabeth, you got it.
I can just get started, and I'm sure other folks have other ideas. And again, it's thrilling to hear, Nick and Brad, what you guys are up to at the state level, and these have to go hand in glove, the federal and the state efforts. So we're really excited to get to share some space with you and learn more about what you're doing. Larry, I also understand your question beyond Phil's gloss to be, is HR 1 constitutional? And I think what is really important for all of us to spread the news about is that states definitely have control over elections. The federal government, through the Constitution, the Elections Clause, Article 1, Clause 4, Section 1, is expressly empowered to work on federal elections. And the undergirding of the bill is that the Constitution, in one of these rare instances, is very plain about Congress's power, and that we actually have conservative justices. I believe Justice Scalia is actually on record talking about the fact that Congress has a pretty wide power when it comes to elections. So what I can tell you is, certainly as a former congressional staffer, folks are very careful not to waste time. This is an 818-page bill that the vast majority of it is actually not new. And as was mentioned during these presentations, a lot of these features have been in place all across the country successfully. Vote by mail dates back to the Civil War, right? So even the more new features like automatic voter registration, it's in red and blue states and has survived challenges for some time. So I think, Larry, to your question, we know what a hostile environment we may be going into. Again, as a lawyer, I think it's incredibly important to never assume that we know how something is going to come out because of who appointed someone. And it's been a great joy. I love to remind people that, the great Justice Warren was a fighter for Japanese internment in California. People change. People become wiser when they have particularly seats like that have really the gravity of the American people and the democracy behind them. So I don't want to be cynical to start, but I think the back end for me, the belt and suspenders part of this, is that this bill is constitutional. It has constitutional authority behind it, and it was very carefully crafted to make sure that we were aware of what the fault lines were going to be and that we avoided them as much as possible, because we know that we live in a very litigious moment. But I am confident that this will survive constitutional muster. And I think one of the best indicators of that, honestly, Larry, is the fact that the best arguments that you're seeing against the bill are lies. So, when Ted is out there saying, the bill lets non-citizens vote, the bill lets 16-year-olds vote, none of that is true. And if you can beat a drum to say the best facts that they have are lies, it means that we're doing the right thing. And it means that they don't actually have good constitutional lines to fall back on. So I think remind people that if your worst enemy can't say anything true about you, you're doing all right.
Nick, Brad, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Nothing to add, except we are in a moment with some really hostile judges at every level. We saw that in Florida at our state courts during the Amendment 4 returning citizens voting litigation. But yeah, you draft these laws defensively and you make the best case you can, and you don't, and then you do what you can to get the judges appointed that will rule fairly, and I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Right? Do you have anything?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that as Nick said, supervisors of elections and their counterparts in their states have a great deal of flexibility, and they're very creative at following the law and working around it to help voters if needed. So a lot of what we'll need to do, regardless of what happens, is either one, make them do the most creative, ambitious implementation of the federal law when it passes, hopefully. But if it doesn't, or if it gets caught up in the courts, we're still going to be working with them to deal with whatever comes at us. I think that fight's just never ending. And I should say that opportunity is never ending. That opportunity is there regardless of what happens in the courts, regardless of what happens with federal legislation, to be honest. But I am very hopeful that it'll pass.
As I understand this, so it's already passed through the House. It's sitting ready to go in the Senate anyway. And we know that our senators here in Florida are probably unlikely to support it, no matter how many times we call them. Now, I know that many people would say, well, there's no point in calling if you don't think they're ever going to do anything. But I know that there are an awful lot of people that would say, you know what, if a loud enough drumbeat is in the ear of a politician that people, the rank and file constituency wants them to vote in a certain direction, strange things happen. And so for those who might not think that Senator Rubio or Senator Scott could possibly ever vote for this, it never hurts to call. It costs pretty much nothing to pick up the phone and talk to their staff. or drop them an email or write them a paper letter. Some of the strangest things have happened in the past, and if we're really, really lucky, maybe this is going to happen. Listening to Elizabeth talk gives me hope. And I hope that the people that are listening here today have enough hope to try to change the question. We have somebody who's been waiting with their hand up, and that is Bill McKay. Bill, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks, Phil. Thanks, everybody, for sharing information. Actually, a lot of it's been answered. I had a couple questions, but I won't say if, I'm going to say when H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voters' Rights Act are passed, what should we be looking for with the federal laws that those laws can help us? Those bills can help us fight. I'm not sure I'm making that clear. How will they help us fight on state level against the things that are happening here in Florida? There's a whole lot happening here, as we've all discussed.
Who would like to take that?
I'd love to give a start. So a lot of the voter registration aspects of HR 1, as well as the automatic voter registration and same-day registration amendments that we're pushing in Florida. As Brad knows, an enormous amount of resources goes into just registering people to vote, making sure that people are on the voting rolls, not even getting them to turn out, right? Just making sure that they are registered, or making sure that they're registered correctly, that everything's updated. And imagine if all of those resources, of all of the groups, of all of the campaigns that go into that can be saved to get actually to get people to turn out or to do other more meaningful things, if you don't have to worry about making sure that people are on the rolls 30 days ahead of an election. So that's one thing. It saves an enormous amount of resources that we can focus on other stuff and persuading people. And then the other aspect is the protections against gerrymandering. We had, I would be remiss if I didn't flag that redistricting is coming up everywhere, but especially in Florida, and that's an huge opportunity for everyone to make sure that their legislators know that we are watching them, that in Florida, we have fair districts amendments that are supposed to prohibit gerrymandering, that we saw the legislature blatantly ignore and make a mockery of last cycle. And it took 4 years of litigation to unravel that. And now we have a state judiciary that is probably not going to look as intently on gerrymandering as we did last cycle, which means that our efforts on the front end in the legislature have to be even more intense to make sure that people know that we need them to do the right thing and that we're watching. And if HR 1 passes, it'll be a lot easier because at least for congressional districts, gerrymandering would be illegal. And at least in future cycles would be in the hands of independent commissions rather than the legislature. And meaning that, right, I mean, I probably don't need to explain what that would mean to have a protection for fair districts, meaning that we could, voters can elect the politicians that they want rather than the other way around, the politicians picking their voters. And then I'm really glad that you mentioned the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because I think that's a piece that is often overlooked. Restoring Section 5, the preclearance regime of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court gutted in 2013 is absolutely critical. It's just as critical as HR 1, and directly impacts Florida, and actually goes even broader than what the old Voting Rights Act did that was struck down, because under the John Lewis Act, all of Florida would be under preclearance when the legislature passes an elections bill like they did this past session. That would have to get pre-cleared, pre-approved by the Department of Justice in DC, who would have to look at that and make sure that it didn't have a discriminatory impact on minority voters. And that would slow down and block a lot of these laws that we're seeing across the country in the most problematic states would be subject to that preclearance regime. And so, yeah, that all of these, and there's obviously more in the bill that just means that it would be a lot easier to turn the people's will into outcomes, policy outcomes in the legislature, right? And that's what this is all about, is making sure that our elected officials do what the people want. We see the ballot initiatives is kind of a good example. We see the voters passing medical marijuana, land and water conservation, voting rights restoration with super majorities. This is Florida we're talking about, and 71% of people voted for the land and water conservation amendment. Okay, that's insane. It's amazing. But why wasn't that a bill? Why wasn't that a law that the legislature passed, right? But if we had these measures in place, where the legislature felt like they are actually going to be real consequences to not doing the things that the people wanted, then we wouldn't have to resort to that, right? And all of this is in service of that, I think.
Brad, Elizabeth, anything to add?
I think Nick absolutely nailed on the head. The other thing that I like to highlight, and particularly, we've all looked at some of these bills and go, who even thought of that? Who even thought, let's not let people have water, right? And I think one of the things that I can't overemphasize enough is that these bills are motivated by finding creative ways to stop people from coming to vote. And one of the great benefits of HR 1 passing, we're just setting a minimum standard where it's no longer a question about whether it's hard for eligible Americans to vote. And that takes away an incentive for legislators to be really creative about how horrible they can treat their voters. I think that's where so much energy is going right now, that exactly to Nick's point, think about what we could do with those resources, both on the good side, on the defense and the offense, for that happening. And I think the other, so emphasizing, and this kind of comes back to something that Phil had said, one of the things I would really love to raise with all of you all, even though you think your senators may be hostile, one of the silver linings of the Zoom era is that you can invite them into a town hall and all they have to do is turn on their computer. Marco Rubio has been on the front line of saying, I want a diverse Republican Party. I want a party that is really representing a cross-section of America and looks different than maybe the old Republican Party. Well, Marco Rubio should be on a call with all of you brilliant people explaining why he doesn't support a bill that lets people vote, lets diverse folks vote, and lets diverse folks run. And I think, exactly as you said, Phil, you can pick up the phone, you can have a letter, you can make a phone call, but your collective power of asking questions like Senator Rubio, these are things that you say you believe. Can you explain to all of us in this room why you wouldn't back this bill that really is going to diversify the playing field for everybody? Has real power. So I think, don't underestimate your collective power. And I think Nick's point is well taken, that there is a lot of critical work that you've already done. The infrastructure is there in Florida, and the rest of us in the country are watching you and shocked and impressed by what you're doing. But I think HR 1's the starting line. And it's sort of, I think the question that you all get to ask your senators is, Senator, if you think you're good enough to run, I think you should believe that you don't need to suppress a vote or rig an election to win your seat. You must think your ideas are good enough. So why not come talk about those ideas plainly instead of trying to make sure people can't vote to protect your seat? So I think posing those sorts of questions is also really powerful, coming from you in a public forum collectively.
And Bill McKay, I know you said you had a couple of questions. We're following up on one. Bill, did you want to come back to your questions?
No, they actually answered both of my questions, but I'm curious how I would get involved with redistricting. Just where would I look into that to find out what's going on with that? Florida.
Brad, do you have a good answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every civic engagement organization in the state is part of a coalition monitoring it and setting up to weigh in, whether it be through alternative maps or suggested recommended maps, or just monitoring. The past cycle, they did sort of a horse and pony tour of the state, where they held up their maps and tried to justify them and took public comments. So if they do something like that again, there's going to be an opportunity wherever you are in the state to attend one of those hearings and testify. So Common Cause, the Legal Women Voters, ACLU,
okay.
I mean, literally every civic engagement group. We actually are looking at ourselves as playing more of a support role just because everybody else in the universe seems so focused on it. Rightly so. It's incredibly important. It's going to determine the face of Florida politics for the next decade. And I guess, I didn't really get a chance to respond to your last question, Bill. But one, just regardless, I mean, there's a lot in HR 1 and HR 4. HR 1, though, whether it's expanding early voting or changes to absentee voting or vote by mail in Florida, the devil's in the details on the implementation. So you could have the worst bill like what we just had past the state or the best thing past the federal level. We're still going to have to see it implemented fairly and fully. And that brings opportunities for advocates and activists and the public to weigh in.
We should be going to the supervisor and lobbying her locally, correct?
That's, I'll just offer this up as an action. One of the things we do is work with local groups to meet with their supervisors. We've done it with a few different groups where we'll actually help you train your members to meet with them if they need it, and work on an agenda, work on setting up a meeting and a series of asks that make sense based on your experiences and based on what we see from a state or national level, and give you support on doing that. I'd love to work with the Space Coast Progressive Alliance on doing that with Lori Scott. She's never been the worst supervisor. She's actually good in some ways, but she's also not the best. I mean, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. And I think in any case, there's a lot of value to you being engaged directly with her and having a good, strong relationship with her and her knowing you're out here. And that kind of goes back to the question of whether it's worthwhile speaking to a U.S. senator who's probably not going to agree with you. You don't want them saying that no one made the case. You don't want them saying, well, I only heard from the Heritage Action Foundation. I only heard from the Public Interest Law Foundation. And so there's just, it's important to make the case and to make the effort. It's important to have a relationship, even if you disagree with them. And I think it's important to get it in writing too. I'm not an attorney, but I've learned the value of having a paper trail to your communications, having a request for a meeting in writing, having some sort of follow-up, documenting on what happened in the meeting, all of those things. But I mean, again, that's the sort of thing we could do a training with the Space Coast Progressive Alliance on and set up a meeting and work with you on. I'm kind of bouncing around to a lot of places, but another thing, just speaking to the moment and the unique moment we're in, I've never seen, and I don't know if Elizabeth, you and Nick, you've both been doing this a long time too. I mean, I've never seen such a coordinated, well-funded effort to spread disinformation on voting as we have now. I mean, there's so many groups now. I mean, I've started like a Google Doc where I'm tracking them and tracking all the articles. And I mean, I've just off my list, Heritage Action, State Policy Network, Honest Elections Project, PILF, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, Freedom Works. I mean, I could go on and on. There's like, I've never seen anything like this. and we're really going to need all hands on deck to combat it.
Fear does amazing things.
I don't think anyone has seen it in our lifetimes. At least maybe when I was a small child back in the early 60s. But I can say that to specifically to Lori Scott, she's actually she's attended a couple of our meetings. We invited her. We've had her staff come and do straw polls in advance of a number of local elections. They've actually been a pretty reasonable partner. When we've asked them to come, they have come, and both Lori and her staff. And I was invited to participate in a post-election, vote in a ballot, whatever they call it, ballot reconciliation, deal where we were running through ballots, as a representative from one of the parties. But the essence is that can't go far enough. I mean, that's one of the things that is good, is to have good two-way conversation going back and forth, and that letting them know that we're here and watching and we're interested and we support open elections and anything we can do to help. I actually, in advance of the last election, I sent a personal card to her and the whole staff, telling them how much we appreciated, the kind of thing that you like to do as a positive reinforcement, to say we expect fair and open elections, and we thank you for doing everything you can, and we're right here with you. The essence is we're all people, and if we attack them, if we only are seen as an adversary, it doesn't build bridges. What I can tell you about our local SOE is that we do have a conversation going, and they know our phone number and we have theirs, so that's a good thing. Our next question, Ellen Jones, you're up, Ellen.
Okay. A question that I have been asked more than once is what is the difference between HR 4 and HR 1? Very basic. And Elizabeth yesterday had a beautiful analogy, a snappy comeback for that. So,
Elizabeth, it sounds like it's for you.
So, okay, I was you're a plant, Ellen. All right. So I think the easiest way to explain it, the analogy we came up with yesterday is you go to the doctor for your annual physicals to make sure that your body is in good health, that your whole system is doing well, to kind of get checked up. And you also go for preventive care so that your whole system is in good shape so things don't go wrong. And that's exactly what Nick and Brad were talking about, that the availability of knowing where your drop boxes are means there's not confusion, of having regular and reliable absentee ballots that mean you know you're going to vote by mail. System is healthy, everything's going well, and it's sort of not a disaster zone. The benefit of it is, like we talked about, for groups who have sort of been left out because of disparate impacts, having a system that works for everybody means it works even for those who've been traditionally left out. So that's a cool thing that HR 1 does. It fixes a whole system with no specific focus on one group or another, but the ancillary benefit of the fact that groups that have been left out are actually treated just like everybody else. That's HR 1. HR 4, I think if that's your preventive care, your physical checkup at the doctor, your annual, HR 1 is when you go in to have surgery to take out a tumor. HR 4 rather. HR 4 is saying a state is trying to make a change in their voter law. We need the DOJ to take a look at that specific law and see, is that a benign law or is that a nasty malignant tumor that we need to cut right out? And I think the cool thing about HR 4, when the Voting Rights Act was in full force, the states, knowing that the DOJ was going to look at what they were doing, actually deterred them from bringing bad bills. So not only was it cutting out bad things that were happening, I like to think of it as a cancer prevention mechanism. Its existence alone meant that states weren't going to go try shenanigans because they knew they weren't going to get away with it because we had a vigilant DOJ. So if you had to explain the same way that you would never only get surgery to take care of your health, and you would also never only go for your annual physical and never get something checked out if something was wrong, those two things need to work in tandem. And I think that's how you explain to folks how HR 1 and HR 4 work together. It's preventive healthcare to keep a healthy system that's functioning and works for everybody. And it's also making sure that when something goes wrong, somebody's there to make sure that they're intervening and cutting that off at the pass before it metastasizes and destroys the whole system, which is what, democracy is meant to function as a whole. So that's kind of my best explanation. It's a bit, how do you guys feel like that works as an analogy? How do you feel?
yeah.
Nick? Oops, let's see if we can fix that.
Nothing to add. That was perfect.
Thumbs up.
Well, I'll tell you what, we have Larry Abdullah's got another question. Larry, what's your question?
I just want to say it's really great that we have initiatives on the poll for 2022 that we're going to be voting on, possibly. You mentioned that, but I didn't get the details on how that might be worded. That it would be something like the Returning Citizens initiative, that we would all sign petitions to get it on the ballot in 2022, I think is what you were saying.
Yep, exactly. So there are 3 initiatives. One of them does repair the damage that the legislature did to Amendment 4, and would allow, it essentially prohibits voting eligibility from being denied based on any debt, which includes fines, fees, and court costs that the legislature requires returning citizens to pay in order to vote. So that's number 1. That's the Voting Eligibility Restoration Amendment. Number 2 would institute automatic voter registration so that people's voter registration is updated, or that they are registered to vote when they apply for, renew, update a driver's license or state ID card. And number 3, the Register and Vote Amendment would allow people to register and vote at the same time on Election Day or during early voting, same day registration, as it's called in other states. So all 3, yes, need to get 891,000 signatures from registered voters to be placed on the 2022 November ballot. And then that'll be before the voters next November.
Wow, so many opportunities for us to get involved.
Absolutely.
And I love that because in Florida, we register a month before the registration cuts off. The website crashes a month before the election. Then they open it up for a couple hours the next day. In Detroit, where I canvass, they can register right up till election day. So there's a big difference. And there's just so many.
Exactly. Another thing I'll mention as another just like critical step that people can take if they're interested is to be a poll worker. I think we saw last election, there was a little bit of this, and I'm not sure if it's going to continue, but there were very nefarious and sinister efforts in pockets across the country to infiltrate the nonpartisan poll workers working elections with partisan actors who wanted to mess stuff up. And it's critical. I mean, in Florida generally, my experience has been as both a voter and a poll worker here that we have fairly well-run elections. Our supervisors, although we have bones to pick with some of them. Definitely, some of them are more hostile than others, but in general, they are there to serve the voters. But it's crucial that relies on regular people taking a day, like a 16-hour day, a very long day. Plus training in advance to become a poll worker. And as I mentioned, I'm sure all y'all know there are different municipal elections this year. Would be an opportunity to at least sign up and see if they need folks and get the experience. And then you're in the system. And if you can take the time off, it's very rewarding. It's fun. I think it's fun. And it's a critical step.
Thank you. And we hopefully won't have COVID then. So
exactly.
In fact, I'll tell you what, we've been waiting for our Space Coast Progressive Alliance president to actually come on board, and Raed Al-Shaibi is with us. Raed, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you for covering. I'm sorry I had to jump in about 15 minutes late, but I enjoyed the discussion. And I just want to say, I didn't get a chance to vote till I was 42 years old. And for people who talk about, vote suppression, and I was suppressed all my life from voting. So it's really important for all of us to educate a lot of people, and to also, there's a lot of people who are able to vote but are not voting right now. They just elect not to vote, or because they're not interested, or because they don't see the importance of it. So that's another angle that unfortunately educating people about the importance of being part of a democracy is so important. So I just want to thank the speakers. It was very important to go through some of these little details that are important for all of us here to make sure everything is clear and we're not being challenged for our rights. So just thank you for all the speakers. Thank you, Phil, and for the organizers. We have I messed up last time, but I know we have a great APC that keep bringing these kind of discussions. So thanks, Ellen, Barbara, and Bonnie, and my friend. I was just getting the names mixed up here. Larry, of course, Larry. To put this together, and we just a great discussion, and I want to thank everyone. Thank you for Phil for covering for me at the beginning.
You're very welcome, Raed, and thank you so much for leading our organization. You have been out front in our community at a time when very few people are afraid to be out front. Very few people are willing to speak out. As a result of the last 4 years, we've had a little taste of what it's like to live in a dictatorship, in an authoritarian democracy where people are working actively to take your voice away. Raed, you have risen to the moment to say that you've seen it. You've seen what real dictatorship is like. The thing that is shocking is that the average American does not realize what's happening. I think that many people are willfully negligent, willfully ignorant of what's happening. They'll turn the TV off because they don't want to hear what's going on. We talk about what a great election it is when we get 30% of our population to actually vote, and it's insanity. Why it is that people and many people are burnt out. They just don't trust politics. They don't trust politicians. I have personally knocked on doors since I was 16 years old, begging people to vote. And And honestly, I've never felt more uncomfortable than I have in the past few years hearing the things that people are saying. People are afraid. There are people in our country that are afraid to go out and protest or wave a sign on the street because they're afraid that the new laws that have been passed they may be arrested for disrupting traffic flow or harassing people. This is insanity. In the United States of America, we're going to have to fight to return comfortable civil discourse back. And Ryan, you've done a wonderful job leading us. And I have to say thank you very much for stepping up to do that, my friend.
Absolutely. And I'm more power to the APC group. They are the one who put all these monthly programs where we're just here to assist and help. So thank you for our action project committee that's always there to keep bringing these. And next month, can you announce again the next month event? I know it's going to be on the second Thursday, right, Phil?
That is correct. The second Thursday, which will be July 8th, we'll right here on Facebook Live and Zoom, and it's called Where Hate Resides. We'll be talking about the fact that hate organizations are here. We know that there's a Klan headquarters listed right in Cocoa. If you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center hate map, you can take a quick look around our neighborhoods, no matter where you live. You look around our nation and realize that Nazis and Klansmen and, in the wake of January 6th, we've learned that many of our neighbors support these groups. It's depressing. It's horrific. Anyway, so we'll be talking about that next month. And by the way, you mentioned the Action Projects Committee. At the end of our event tonight, at the end of this Zoom, for those that are guests, those that are people that have joined us, people that might be interested in being a member of SCPA or past members that might be interested in getting involved again, we're going to actually stay live for anybody that would like to stay on for a few minutes after this event on Zoom to just talk a little bit about the event, to encourage people to get involved in SCPA or in the Action Projects Committee if you like to make this kind of event happen. And we certainly welcome anybody that wants to stay with us to do so. So it's an opportunity. We actually have just about 5 minutes to go, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to pause for a second to ask our three speakers to kind of review what kind of an action item do you think you would like to leave us with? We know that if our audience goes home, or, turns off their computer and just sits on what they've learned tonight, that we've lost. We've failed in our efforts. We know that we succeed when we spread the word, when we spread the knowledge that we've gained tonight. We've all learned something new. I've certainly heard a couple things here tonight that I had no idea about. And man, I'll tell you what, I'll be babbling in the ears of a number of my friends. I'm going to be meeting with my sisters tomorrow, and they're going to get an earful of this. But we have to all do this. We have to make a point of spreading the word, talking about what's happening. We're talking about HR1, passing on. If you, again, go to the chat, take a quick look at some of the things that are here, some great website. Go to our website, www.scpaflorida.com, and have a quick look around, see what information you can learn and you can spread to the community to educate each other. So our three speakers tonight, what kind of action item, Elizabeth, would you like to leave people with?
I don't want to go first, Phil.
Would you want me to leave you for last?
I'll go middle.
All right. In which case, let me see if I can. There's Nick. Would you like to go?
Sure. So I would say I'm going to drop it in the chat to the direct page. Go to Fair Elections Florida. Fill in your information. You'll get mailed a petition, 3 petitions to put these 3 measures on the ballot to remake our state, to open our democracy, and make sure that everyone is able to vote if they want to, and to tell your friends and family about it.
And Brad, what would you like to leave our guests, our viewers with?
Well, let me put our URL, and please sign up to receive our updates so you're in the loop on what we're working on. And No, I think I phrased it as an offer before, but I'll frame it more as an ask. We are going to meet with Lori Scott. we have asks for the supervisors of elections around the state to mitigate the damage that's going to come from this state voter suppression bill that just passed. I'd love to have somebody from the Space Coast Progressive Alliance, if not several people, participate in that, and would love to have your input on what we should talk to. We have our own sort of agenda on things we think would make the election run more smoothly, given what was just passed in the legislature, but we'd love your input as well. So if there's a way to participate in one of your meetings or in your coalition so that we're working with you to be as effective as possible and as persuasive as possible with her, I'd love to do that.
Excellent,
Would
Rod.
love to join. Absolutely. Would love to join. Sorry, just want to say we do connect through ACLU, and I'm sure we will connect through your efforts. Would love to join you when on your visit to Scott's. Yeah, absolutely.
Let me know. I'll be there.
Actually, you know what? One of the wonderful things about the Space Coast Progressive Alliance is that if you take a Venn diagram of all sorts of action organizations, progressive organizations, and otherwise, and look at the overlap of many of our members, we're really, I'm often really impressed by how many folks are so active, so working so hard in so many different areas of our community. And so I tell you what, this is a terrific opportunity, folks. This is somebody opening the door for a really productive opportunity. Elizabeth, back to you. I know that you want to talk probably about HR1, but maybe you want to talk about your event tomorrow. What time is that event tomorrow, by the way?
Oh, so it's at 5:30. Here you go. These kids made a fun website. So there's the fun website. I've put it in the chat. I think that's one thing you can certainly do. Please come tomorrow night and tell others to come tomorrow night, because it's very unusual that democracy is funny. And I think tomorrow democracy might be a little bit funny. So I'm hoping that will draw some people in and maybe to learn something about a bill that they haven't. Somebody made the point the other day that COVID is getting 19% of American news coverage, and this bill that could transform a democracy is getting sub 1% of American news coverage. So it's really up to all of us to let people know about the existence of this bill. So one, come tomorrow. Two, there's this thing I'm just going to drop in the chat here that's for Florida, specifically from my great team at the Brennan Center, and it draws a one-to-one connection between what has happened in your state and how HR1 would respond. So I want all of you to take it as your responsibility. Anytime anybody says, here's a thing you should be miserable about and feel cynical about, and go do wonderful work with Brad and Nick about, I want the second thing you say after you say, go do work with Brad and Nick, is there's a federal bill that would make sure not only does this not get to happen in Florida, it doesn't get to happen in any state across this country, because nobody deserves that, right? Instead of fighting 48 fights across this entire nation, why don't we just fight one, right? So we can, as we said, get to the good stuff that actually is going to happen. And then the third thing that I will sort of leave you as a very concrete ask, besides I'm going to be looking out for your faces tomorrow night, is think about how you can amplify power. So there's a specific piece of information you have, which most people don't know. There is one federal bill that's not an idea, that is a literal binder full of information that's already passed one House of Congress and is ready to pass the second. So you now know that. I need you to let everybody know that. And I want you to figure out not just how you can make that one call, but how you will amplify your power. So I guess my challenge to you, my call to action to you, is not just what I can do myself, Larry, or what I can do myself, Ingrid, is how can I get together with people who are in my state who clearly care about this and make it bigger than just me. So I want to see coordinated letters to the editor. I want a call to Marco Rubio. I want an open letter saying, sir, you say you stand for these values. Come talk to us about this, right? Make a challenge, because the next month, Chuck Schumer has officially said this thing is coming to the floor on the week of June 21st. So we have 3 weeks to raise hell. And I will say also, Kamala Harris, my old boss, is pretty extraordinary as a pioneering person, the first woman, the first person of color to hold a role like that. And she always says she doesn't want to be the last. The White House has incredible power to make sure that whatever our two senators who are sort of standing in the way of this, Ms. Sinema and Mr. Manchin, need, the White House can deliver. And so I would challenge you to think about what sort of calls you could make to say, Kamala, deliver on the incredible thing that Joe Biden has tasked you with doing. And I actually say stay tuned. If you want to, you can follow my Twitter or, be in touch with me, and you can, find me through Ellen. But I think there's a nascent word about sort of a campaign to sort of put some pressure on the White House to make that happen, to let Kamala know that we're behind her, and that when President Biden tasked her with that we actually are keep supporting her in that effort. So yeah, I guess my concrete thing is figure out how powerful you are and let it be amplified. So thrilled to talk to you all tonight. And one of the best things I've ever heard is that the opposition to this bill is not the opposition. The opposition to this bill is cynicism. And all that's possible is possible because you make it possible. So the fact that you're doing this tonight and that we're all making connections with each other and we'll know each other from here on in is, to me, emblematic of that. So congratulations to you all on this work.
Well, Elizabeth Hira, Brad Asheville, Nicholas Warren, I hope that, first of all, if everybody that's on here, please unmute. Let's give them a round of applause. Hooray. Thank you so much.
Great time.
We really do. Again, we'd be jumping up and down, giving you a standing ovation and big hugs because this is a wonderful night. We're so lucky and honored to have you all aboard. I'd like to remind everybody that the next SCPA event will be July 8th. It will be the second Thursday of July, Where Hate Resides, taking a serious look at this issue of hate groups in America and what we can do about that. And I would like to again remind anybody that is interested in sticking around after this event, becoming involved in the Action Projects Committee, to please hang in there with us because we'll have a little chat afterward. But thank you to everyone. Thanks to all of you for joining with us tonight. Those that have been on Facebook Live, as well as our friends that are on Zoom. Thank you so much tonight to our three speakers, wonderful people, and let us hope that we can make some progress together. Look forward to seeing you all in the future. Absolutely, everybody. Thank you. And again,
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
That link. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys were awesome.
Excellent. Excellent.
what a beautiful night. Thanks to our producers again. And our APC, our Active Projects Committee, will hang on with us, and we'll have a nice little chat afterward. The rest of you folks, have a great evening. We'll look forward to seeing you next month.